Trump administration officials have confirmed that The Atlantic was inadvertently invited to a Signal group chat to discuss war plans against the Houthis in Yemen. There were rumors that, on one hand, maybe the Trump administration did this on purpose to inadvertently leak their comms and how they strategize. But the bigger question that's coming up is, why are they using Signal? Now, we know that Elon Musk likes to use Signal, so it's possible that the use of Signal was a suggestion from Musk, or it's something that's been common through the use within the Trump administration. But one of the downsides of Signal is that you have, well, disappearing messages, which are downsides to Americans because you sort of lack that transparency, which technically you could sort of recoup if you accidentally leak it all, but it's very different from what you would ordinarily see in, let's say, a financial and regulatory point of view. See, ordinarily, if you work in the finance space, for example, you need to document and preserve your emails and communications for at least 6 years, at least, could be more than that. Sometimes you'll actually even have to take screenshots of text messages that you're taking to make sure these things are being appropriately documented, so that way if there's ever a freedom of information request or whatever, that information is available, and we can evaluate whether or not our officials are actually being truthful in what their actions are, and they're operating with integrity. Now, this apparently didn't happen because, well, A, the Department of Defense is using Signal, which again features the sort of disappearing messages, but an Atlantic journalist was really skeptical, and I'll give you the bottom line on this basically, or just give you sort of the TLDR in case you don't want to read the whole story. An Atlantic journalist was invited by somebody he thought was, familiar from the Department of Defense, but he thought, hey, there's a chance that because Trump's administration likes attacking the media, that maybe somebody who's affiliated with Trump or just Republicans in general was trying to ambush this journalist, invite them to sort of a fake AI chat and make it seem like they were part of a chat so they could run the story and then look like fools. This has happened previously. Journalists obviously don't like that, but, then again, hey, if you screw up and you don't verify information, you have some blame as well, right? So the Atlantic journalist discusses being invited to this Signal chat with his staff, and he's like, okay, this is weird, maybe this could all be a fraud. I mean, it's called Houthi PC Group, and they're which is a principal committees group, and there are plenty of individuals involved, including people identifying themselves as being part of Marco Rubio's staff, Secretary of State's staff, J.D. Vance's staff, Tulsi Gabbard's staff for the Director of National Intelligence, CIA staff, Department of Defense staff, individuals who also in some part aren't named because they are secret agents, essentially, for the government. And what they do is they discuss war plans for how they want to attack a Houthi group in Yemen. And of course, it's possible that all of this information was fake, but at this point, we already know that the Trump administration confirmed they accidentally invited an Atlantic journalist to the text chain. And nobody asked that journalist why they were there. It was just sort of, I guess nobody checked why there was somebody who wasn't authorized to be part of this in this chain. And so what ended up happening was they had strong doubts that the comments were real, but they break down sort of a timeline of what happened. They talk about at 8:05 how the team had discussions with the president about whether or not the Department of Defense should actually end up attacking the Houthis in Yemen and the strategy they're undertaking. J.D. Vance takes this position, apparently, or his team takes this position of, hey, we got to be careful getting involved in so many international conflicts, especially when the benefits aren't clearly to the upside of the United States. J.D. Vance argues that only 3% of trade runs through the Suez Canal, whereas 40% of European trade does. So in other words, let the Europeans pay for it or handle it. However, there's some argument that Donald Trump wants to send a message of strength. This is where there was a lot of rumoring around maybe this was really just a way to sort of showcase how the Trump administration is trying to be different from the Biden administration. That's one argument. Another argument is they just totally made the mistake, and given the White House has now confirmed that this was just a mistake, it was a mistake, which is kind of an egg-on-face mistake, because if you're going to be talking literally about bombing people, you'd think you'd make sure you're talking to people that you've confirmed their identity. So you're not inadvertently leaking your bombing plans and which weapons or, air stations you're using to launch these attacks from, because obviously they could leave us disrupted to counterattacks or open to counterattacks. China just had, there was sort of this talk about China's cable cutter that became really popular over the weekend. There's this talk about China has sort of these vehicles, essentially these boats that can cut 95% of the data that runs throughout the essentially deep sea through deep sea telecommunication cables that help us with internet connections, cell phone calls, that are then routed over cable networks throughout the ocean rather than through satellites. And if China can sort of disrupt the internet or cell comms or whatever, then we've got to be really careful, because that is a potential form of warfare or a strategy that China could take to strong-arm the United States in the event of some form of conflict. And so leaking our plans is never a great idea. This is why they're obviously heavily safeguarded. So going back to the story, though, what's fascinating here is they talk about how they've been working on these time frames and timelines, and how there's an option of just waiting. But if they wait, there's a risk that they jeopardize operational security because there could be leaks, which is really ironic because they're talking about preventing leaks while literally inadvertently leaking everything that they're talking about. They end up deciding to go ahead with the attack, and the journalist is like, okay, this is odd. Like, let's see if the attack actually happens. And you could see some of this conversation here about the president's desire to reopen shipping lanes. This, mind you, is really important, as well as some of the comments here, like, and if there are things we can do up front to minimize the risk to Saudi oil facilities, we should do it. You kind of see some alignment here with goals. You're trying to make sure oil prices stay down. You're trying to make sure shipping prices stay down so you can cheer disinflation rather than inflation, right? Higher costs of oil, higher costs of shipping are all inflationary pressures, which go against Donald Trump's goals and actually hurt his goal of promoting, economic welfare with smaller government and, frankly, a revitalized private sector. So you see a lot of Trump coming through on these conversations here. But again, the group is painfully unaware that there's a journalist listening to everything. And so they finally get the green light to go ahead with the attack. Vance's team apparently writes, "I will say a prayer for victory." And the journalist is like, all right, I'm just going to look on X to see if there are any reports of attacks going on in Yemen. And sure enough, at the time the attacks were supposed to occur, the bombings actually occurred. And so at this point, the journalist is like, oh my gosh, this is real. Goes back to the Signal chat, and this is what you get. Excellent, John Radcliffe, a good start. Michael Waltz, fist emoji, American flag, fire emoji. Good job, Pete and your team. So you actually apparently do have the government now operating through Signal chat. I don't know if this is part of like a Doge initiative, like the Department of Governmental Efficiency, like, hey, let's all use Signal. But it's probably not great from the point of view of actually documenting what our officials are doing, since all this stuff is probably just going to disappear. I highly doubt they're backing all of this stuff up. The only thing that's probably being backed up are, well, frankly, the Atlantic journalists' screenshots. It is really interesting, though, because here you do notice that there's a 4W, which implies that maybe these chats weren't set to automatically disappear, given that when you look closely at that 4W, it implies the screenshots were taken 4 weeks after, so basically when they were planning on running the story compared to when the actual attacks occurred, which is interesting because maybe they're not set to auto-disappear, maybe they are going to document these conversations. I don't know. Usually Signal is not associated with the best of like, oh yeah, let's document all of your conversations and verify people's identities. At least if you're using a service like, obviously hashtag not sponsored, if you're using a chat program like Google Chat or something, you verify that somebody's at least using passkeys and they're using their login, and you can verify that they're using, the sort of advanced account protection features, literally called advanced protection over at Google, just to secure their accounts. And so there's a greater chance that the person you're talking to is actually the person you think you're talking to. I'm not sure what kind of security protocols there are on Signal, but it does sort of raise the question of like, why aren't we using things like the sensitive compartmented information facility to discuss, you know, these sort of sensitive things? Like, why are we using Signal? Now, what if these people had lost their phones? How do you verify that you have the right people on here? Now, what you could also do, and what I like to do, is have a more secure passcode on my phone. I don't like having a little 4-digit code, so people can kind of look over your shoulder and see that. So I use a much more lengthy password to get my phone because most of the time I'm using Face ID anyway. But you could also hold down the app and then require Face ID or your passcode to open an app, even if the app doesn't have a login function itself, which is kind of cool. Like notes on your phone, you can cover that with Face ID, which is kind of cool. So little, you know, sort of sec things that you can improve your own security with. You know, security keys and pass keys, I think, are great. But it's kind of odd to see things that literally have people's lives hanging in the balance are being communicated over Signal. So not sure how I feel about that. Not very good. But I will say that this was not on my bingo board. I did not expect to be making a video on the president and their team, basically, or the team of the president, having a celebratory, yay, we got the Houthis chat on Signal. So, and I also don't know what courts can do about this sort of stuff. You know, I mean, the executive branch is given so much power. I don't think you're going to get like a John Roberts, who's already kind of hit on Trump a little bit, like, hey guys, you know, be careful here with how much you're overstepping. I don't think you're going to get like a John Roberts being like, hey, you need to use Google Chat, sponsored by Google Chat. You know, so, whew. Crazy world. But anyway, that's a breakdown of this article for you. If you found it helpful, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll see you in the next one. Goodbye. Good luck.
Why not advertise these things that you told us here? I feel like nobody else knows about this.
We'll try a little advertising and see how it goes.
Congratulations, man. You have done so much. People love you. People look up to you.
Kevin Paffrath there, financial analyst and YouTuber. Meet Kevin. Always great to get your take.